They discovered her 3 days after the massacre, buried beneath the corpses of her own family, her cotton dress soaked crimson with blood that wasn't hers, clutching a torn piece of paper that would expose the most ruthless conspiracy the Colorado Territory had ever seen. When Cheyenne War Chief Iron Hawk heard the faint whisper of prayers drifting from what appeared to be a field of the dead, he almost dismissed it as wind through the canyon walls, until he realized the words were in perfect Cheyenne, spoken by a white woman who should have been as lifeless as the 17 other bodies scattered across the burned wagon train.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning sun cast long shadows across Devil's Canyon as Chief Iron Hawk guided his war party through the narrow passage that separated Cheyenne hunting grounds from the white settlers' emigrant trail. The air still carried the acrid smell of smoke and death that had drawn them to investigate what the vultures had already discovered, another wagon train that would never reach its destination. Iron Hawk had seen such scenes before. The Colorado Territory in 1864 was a place where violence bloomed as regularly as wildflowers after spring rain, where conflicts between his people and the endless stream of gold seekers created a landscape littered with the bones of both races. But as his horse picked its way carefully between the scattered debris of what had once been the Whitmore family wagon train, something felt different about this particular massacre. The 17 bodies were arranged too carefully. The wagons had been burned too systematically. And most troubling of all, the attack showed none of the hallmarks of Cheyenne, Arapaho, or any other tribal warfare that Iron Hawk recognized. This looked like the work of white men disguised as Indians, a deception that had become increasingly common as territorial officials sought to blame native tribes for crimes they hadn't committed. Cassandra Whitmore had been hiding beneath the corpses of her husband and twin sons for 73 hours when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her body had grown so stiff from maintaining the same position that she wasn't certain she could move even if escape were possible. The dried blood that covered her dress had attracted flies that crawled across her face and arms like living reminders of her helplessness. Yet she remained perfectly still, her breathing so shallow that even she sometimes wondered if she had actually died, and simply hadn't realized it yet. The whispered prayers that eventually betrayed her presence weren't intentional. They had begun on the second day, when delirium from dehydration and shock had weakened her careful control. The words came in Cheyenne because that was the language her mind retreated to under extreme stress, the language that Morning Star had taught her during the 2 years Cassandra had lived among the tribe as a child, before her missionary parents had reclaimed her for what they called civilization. Maheo Nako Viho, she breathed in a voice barely stronger than exhalation. Great Spirit, help me. The prayer repeated itself like a heartbeat, automatic and unconscious, until it reached the ears of the one person in all of Colorado Territory who could understand both her words and her desperate situation. Iron Hawk dismounted 20 feet from the cluster of bodies where Cassandra lay hidden, his weathered face grave as he studied the scene. At 42, he had survived more battles than most men saw in several lifetimes, had learned to read the story that death scenes told about their killers. This story was written in a language of deception that filled him with cold rage. Scalping had been done wrong clumsily, by someone who had seen it performed, but never learned the proper technique. The arrow wounds were inconsistent with Cheyenne arrows, which is people fletched with turkey feathers in a distinctive pattern that these crude imitations couldn't replicate. Most damning of all, several of the victims showed powder burns from rifles fired at close range, execution-style killings that no honorable warrior would have performed. White men wearing war paint, growled Grey Wolf, Iron Hawk's war chief, as he examined a footprint that clearly showed the heel mark of a cavalry boot. They want everyone to think we did this. Iron Hawk nodded grimly, but his attention was focused on something else. a sound so faint that it might have been imagination. He raised his hand, signaling his warriors to remain silent as he strained to identify what his ears had detected. There beneath the rustle of wind through sagebrush and the distant cry of circling ravens, came the almost inaudible whisper of Cheyenne words spoken in prayer. The sound was coming from beneath a pile of bodies, near the largest burned wagon, where a man, woman, and two young boys lay tangled together in what appeared to be a final embrace. Iron Hawk approached carefully, his moccasined feet making no sound on the rocky ground. As he drew closer, the whispered prayers became clearer, spoken in the pure dialect of the northern Cheyenne that few white people had ever mastered. Nako viho ni me hotzi, the voice breathed. Help me, I am dying. Iron Hawk knelt beside the bodies and gently moved the corpse of a middle-aged man, revealing the pale, blood-stained face of a woman whose green eyes stared up at him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old, with auburn hair matted with dried blood and dirt. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her skin burned by 3 days of exposure to the Colorado sun, but she was unmistakably alive. More remarkably, when she saw Iron Hawk's paint-streaked face above her, she didn't scream or try to flee. Instead, she whispered in flawless Cheyenne, "Ni isi Iron Hawk? Are you Iron Hawk?" The war chief's eyes widened in surprise. Very few white settlers knew his name, and fewer still could pronounce it correctly in his own language. He studied her face more carefully, noting the high cheekbones and the particular shade of green in her eyes that stirred a distant memory. "How? Do you know my name, white woman?" he asked in English, his voice carefully neutral. "Because Morning Star spoke of you often," Cassandra whispered, still speaking in Cheyenne despite his switch to English. "She said you were the bravest warrior in all the Cheyenne nation, the man who would lead our people to victory against their enemies." The mention of Morning Star hit Iron Hawk like a physical blow. His sister had been killed 2 years earlier, in a cavalry raid on their winter camp, one of many Cheyenne women and children who had died in what the white newspapers called Indian uprisings, but which Iron Hawk knew were unprovoked massacres designed to drive his people from their ancestral lands. "You knew my sister?" he asked, unconsciously reverting to Cheyenne. "She saved my life when I was 7 years old," Cassandra replied, her voice growing stronger as hope began to replace despair. "White slavers had taken me from a wagon train near the Platte River. Morning Star found me 3 days later, half dead from exposure and fear. She brought me to your village, nursed me back to health, taught me your language and customs." Iron Hawk's memory suddenly crystallized. He remembered the frightened white child his sister had brought home, the girl with unusual green eyes who had lived among them for 2 years before her parents' missionaries seeking to establish a church among the Cheyenne had eventually tracked her down and reclaimed her. The child had been called White Dove by the tribe, and she had learned their ways with remarkable speed. "White Dove," he said, using her Cheyenne name for the first time in over 15 years. Tears streamed down Cassandra's dirt-stained cheeks as she nodded. "Morning Star told me that if I ever needed help, if I ever found myself in danger, I should seek out Iron Hawk of the Northern Cheyenne. She said you were a man who honored debts and protected the innocent, regardless of their skin color." Iron Hawk felt the weight of his sister's promise settling across his shoulders like a sacred obligation. Morning Star had died believing that some white people could be trusted, that friendship could exist between the races despite the terrible violence that defined most of their interactions. This woman lying beneath the corpses of her family represented that fragile hope, and abandoning her would be a betrayal of everything his sister had believed. But saving her would also be dangerous. Bringing a white woman into Cheyenne territory during a time of escalating warfare would invite suspicion from his own people and potentially deadly retaliation from white authorities, who would assume she had been kidnapped. The political situation
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
In Colorado, territory had deteriorated to the point where any association between Cheyenne warriors and white civilians was automatically interpreted as hostile. "Tell me what happened here," Iron Hawk said, helping Cassandra sit up while his warriors maintained a protective perimeter around the massacre site. "Tell me how you survived when all the others died." Cassandra looked around at the bodies of her fellow travelers, her face contorting with grief and rage. "They came at dawn 3 days ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Men dressed as Cheyenne warriors, but I could tell they weren't real Indians. Their war paint was wrong. Their horses weren't painted properly, and they moved like cavalry soldiers rather than tribal fighters." Iron Hawk's expression hardened. False flag attacks had become increasingly common as territorial officials sought to justify military action against peaceful tribes. By staging fake Indian raids, corrupt politicians and military contractors could claim federal funding for protective expeditions that actually served to drive native peoples from lands coveted by mining companies and railroad developers. "How many were there?" Gray Wolf asked, joining the conversation. 15, maybe 20, Cassandra replied. "They surrounded our wagons before anyone could react. They killed the men first, quick executions with rifles. Then they ... She paused, struggling to continue. "They took their time with the women and children. Made it look like torture, like what white people expect Indians to do." Iron Hawk felt sick rage building in his chest. These false flag operations weren't just military deceptions. They were calculated atrocities designed to inflame racial hatred and justify genocide. Every fake scalping, every staged mutilation, every fabricated Indian massacre made it easier for politicians to advocate for the complete extermination of all native tribes. "Why didn't they kill you?" Gray Wolf asked suspiciously. "They thought they had," Cassandra said. "I was helping my sister-in-law Sarah tend to her injured son when the shooting started. A bullet hit her in the head and she fell on top of me, covering me with her blood. I pretended to be dead while they finished with the others." She pulled a folded piece of paper from inside her dress, the same document mentioned in the story's opening hook. "But I heard them talking while they worked. They weren't random killers or even ordinary thieves. They mentioned names, places, specific instructions about how to make the attack look authentic. And their leader, a man they called Colonel, he dropped this when he was giving orders." Iron Hawk examined the document carefully. It was written on official military letterhead from Fort Lyon, the main cavalry installation in southeastern Colorado territory. The text was brief but devastating. "Operation Prairie Fire approved. Whitmore train eliminated per schedule. Ensure evidence points to Northern Cheyenne involvement. Next target, Hartwell Freight Convoy, October 20th. Stage attack near Sand Creek to maximize political impact." The signature at the bottom belonged to Colonel John Chivington, the same military commander who had been advocating for what he called total warfare against all Colorado tribes. Iron Hawk had heard Chivington's speeches, had listened to the man declare that all Indians should be killed, including women and children, because nits make lice. "This proves everything," Iron Hawk said grimly, passing the document to Gray Wolf. "Chivington is staging false attacks to justify a war of extermination against our people. But who will believe the word of a Cheyenne war chief?" Gray Wolf asked. "Even with this document, white authorities will claim we forged it or stole it." Iron Hawk looked at Cassandra, understanding suddenly why Morningstar's spirit had guided him to this place at this moment. "They might not believe a Cheyenne," he said slowly, "but they would have to listen to a white woman who witnessed the conspiracy firsthand." Cassandra met his gaze steadily, despite her physical weakness and emotional trauma. "What are you asking me to do?" "Come with us," Iron Hawk said. Help us expose this conspiracy before more innocent people die, both white and Cheyenne. Your testimony, combined with this document, could prevent the war that Chivington is trying to start. And if I refuse? Iron Hawk's expression grew gentle but firm. Then I'll take you to the nearest white settlement, and you can live with the knowledge that your silence allowed more massacres like this one. But Morning Star believed you had the courage to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Cassandra looked around at the bodies of her family one more time, then back at Iron Hawk. When she spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised them both. My husband Marcus was a journalist. He believed that truth was the most powerful weapon against injustice. If staying silent means more families will die like this. She struggled to her feet, except in Iron Hawk's supporting arm. Then I'll come with you. I'll tell the world what really happened here. As Iron Hawk helped Cassandra onto his horse, Grey Wolf approached with disturbing news. War Chief, we found tracks leading away from the massacre site. At least 5 riders, heading southeast toward Fort Lyon. They're probably reporting the success of their mission right now. Iron Hawk nodded grimly. Time was running short. If Chivington's false flag operation was proceeding on schedule, the Hartwell freight convoy would be attacked in just 4 days. Unless they could expose the conspiracy before then, more innocent people would die, and Chivington would have all the justification he needed to launch his war of extermination. How long do we have? Cassandra asked, demonstrating the same quick intelligence that had impressed the Cheyenne as a child. 4 days. Iron Hawk replied. 4 days to reach someone with enough authority to stop a war. But even as they prepared to leave, more disturbing evidence emerged from the massacre site. Spotted Elk, Iron Hawk's tracker, discovered something that made his blood run cold. Hidden beneath one of the burned wagons was a cache of Cheyenne weapons, authentic arrows, war clubs, and ceremonial items that could only have come from their own people. These belonged to Running Bear's war party, Spotted Elk reported, holding up a distinctive lance decorated with eagle feathers in a pattern unique to Iron Hawk's cousin. The same party that was ambushed near the Arkansas River last month. Iron Hawk examined the weapons with growing horror. Running Bear and his 12 warriors had been killed in what they'd assumed was a cavalry patrol encounter. Their bodies had been found scalped and mutilated, their weapons missing. Now those same weapons had been used to frame the Cheyenne for a massacre they hadn't committed. It's worse than we thought, Iron Hawk said to Cassandra, his voice heavy with implications. They didn't just dress as Indians, they're using weapons taken from our dead warriors. Every attack they stage becomes more authentic, more believable. Cassandra felt the full weight of the conspiracy settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about preventing one more false flag attack. Chivington had been systematically collecting evidence to make his fabricated raids increasingly convincing. How many Cheyenne warriors had died to provide props for his theatrical massacres? There's something else, Grey Wolf said, approaching with a grim expression. We found this nailed to a tree on the ridge above the massacre site. He handed Iron Hawk a crude wooden sign painted with blood-red letters. Death to all white invaders, the Cheyenne have spoken. Iron Hawk crushed the sign in his powerful hands, his rage barely contained. No Cheyenne warrior would ever leave such a message. His people fought with honor, not with the crude psychological warfare of terrorizing civilians. This sign was designed for one purpose: to ensure that when the massacre was discovered, there would be no doubt about who was responsible. How far back does this go? Cassandra asked, her journalist's mind working to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. How many attacks have been staged? Iron Hawk considered the question carefully. The Brennan family massacre last spring. The attack on the supply train near Pueblo in June. The raid on the Patterson homestead in August. His expression grew darker with each memory. We denied responsibility for all of them, but no one believed us. Each attack made white settlers more afraid, more willing to support military action against all tribes. And each attack provided Cheyenne with more evidence of Cheyenne aggression, Cassandra realized. He's been building a case for genocide, one fabricated massacre at a time. The political implications were staggering. Cheyenne wasn't just a rogue military commander seeking glory through Indian fighting. He was orchestrating a systematic campaign to justify the complete extermination of Colorado's native tribes. The Whitmore massacre wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger strategy that had been in development for months, possibly years. We need to understand who else is involved, Cassandra said, her voice growing stronger as her sense of purpose crystallized. A conspiracy this complex requires support from civilian authorities, supply officers, probably even government officials in Denver. Iron Hawk nodded approvingly. The frightened woman who had whispered prayers beneath corpses was transforming into someone formidable. Your husband was a journalist. Did he ever write about military contracts, supply arrangements, anything that might connect to this conspiracy? Cassandra's eyes widened as memories surfaced. Marcus was investigating irregularities in military supply contracts just before we left Denver. He said someone was making enormous profit selling outdated weapons and spoiled food to the army at premium prices. He thought it was simple corruption, but what if the corruption was more complex? Iron Hawk finished. What if someone was deliberately weakening military effectiveness to prolong conflicts with the tribes? The conspiracy was revealing new dimensions with each revelation. Cheyenne wasn't just staging false flag attacks, he was potentially involved in a larger scheme to profit from extended warfare. By providing the army with inferior equipment, while simultaneously creating justifications for expanded military operations, corrupt contractors could maximize their profits while minimizing their actual contributions to frontier security. Marcus kept detailed notes about his investigation, Cassandra said. They're hidden in our house in Denver. If we could retrieve them... Too dangerous, Grey Wolf interrupted. Denver is crawling with cavalry patrols. They'd arrest you the moment you appeared in town. Iron Hawk considered their options carefully. Denver represented both opportunity and extreme danger. The territorial capital was where they would need to present their evidence to have any hope of stopping Cheyenne's war. But it was also where Cheyenne's allies would be most numerous and most vigilant. There might be another way, Iron Hawk said slowly. My people have allies among the peaceful tribes, Arapaho, some Ute bands, even some white traders who deal honestly with us. If we could gather enough testimony from multiple sources, a coalition of witnesses, Cassandra said, understanding immediately. Harder to dismiss than the word of a single Cheyenne war chief or one traumatized white woman. Exactly. But it will take time to contact our allies, and time is what we don't have. Cassandra looked back at the massacre site one more time, steeling herself for what she was about to propose. Then we split up. You gather your witnesses while I return to Denver to retrieve Marcus's notes. We meet at an agreed location and present our evidence together. Absolutely not, Iron Hawk said firmly. You wouldn't survive 2 days on your own in hostile territory, and if Cheyenne's agents capture you, they'll torture me for information and then kill me to maintain their secret, Cassandra finished calmly. I understand the risks. But this conspiracy has to be stopped, whatever the cost. Iron Hawk studied her face, seeing in her green eyes the same determination that had once impressed his sister. White Dove had grown into a woman of remarkable courage, someone willing to risk everything for justice. But courage without wisdom was simply another form of suicide. There's a third option, he said finally. We take you to someone who can protect you while also helping expose the conspiracy. Someone with enough authority to challenge Cheyenne directly. Who? General Samuel Curtis, commander of the Department of Kansas. He's been questioning Chivington's methods for months, asking uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of his Indian campaigns. Curtis is an honest soldier who cares more about results than politics. Cassandra felt a spark of hope. Where is he? Fort Leavenworth, in Kansas Territory. It's a hard ride, but possible if we avoid the main trails. That's even further from Denver than we are now, Gray Wolf pointed out. And crossing Kansas means traveling through country where every cavalry patrol will be looking for hostile Indians. Iron Hawk acknowledged the dangers with a grim nod. But Curtis has the authority to countermand Chivington's orders, to investigate his operations, even to arrest him if necessary. He's our best hope for stopping this war before it starts. As they debated their options, Spotted Elk made another disturbing discovery. Hidden in the ashes of the largest wagon was a metal strongbox that had survived the fire. Inside were documents that made the full scope of the conspiracy clear for the first time. The papers included detailed plans for additional false flag attacks, lists of targets throughout Colorado Territory, and most damning of all, correspondence between Chivington and territorial officials discussing the final solution to the Indian problem. The language was bureaucratic and cold, reducing the planned genocide to administrative details and logistics. "Look at this," Cassandra said, studying a particular document with growing horror. "They're planning to attack the peaceful Cheyenne village at Sand Creek. Women, children, elderly people who have never raised a weapon against white settlers." Iron Hawk's face went ashen. Sand Creek was where his own family lived during the winter months, where Morning Star was buried, where 300 peaceful Cheyenne lived under the protection of American flags that they believed guaranteed their safety. "When?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. Cassandra checked the document again. "November 29th. They're calling it a preemptive strike against hostile insurgents. They plan to kill everyone and claim it was a justified military action against a war camp." The November 29th date was less than 6 weeks away. If they failed to expose the conspiracy in time, Iron Hawk would lose not just his political cause, but everyone he had ever loved. The stakes had just become devastatingly personal. "Now we have no choice," Iron Hawk said, his voice carrying absolute determination. "We ride for Fort Leavenworth immediately. General Curtis must see this evidence before Chivington can implement his final solution." As they prepared to leave Devil's Canyon, carrying the terrible knowledge that could save or damn hundreds of innocent lives, Cassandra felt the weight of her transformation settling into her bones. The woman who had whispered prayers beneath her family's corpses was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, more determined, and infinitely more dangerous to those who trafficked in lies and death. She would honor Marcus's belief in the power of truth. She would fulfill Morning Star's faith in her courage. And she would make sure that the men who had slaughtered 17 innocent people to start a war would face the justice they deserved, even if it cost her everything. The real battle was just beginning, and the fate of 2 peoples hung in the balance. The Colorado Territory stretched before them like a vast ocean of grass and stone, painted in shades of amber and rust beneath the October sun. Cassandra had never seen the high plains from horseback before, had never experienced the peculiar sensation of being simultaneously insignificant and exposed that came with traveling across such immense distances, without roads or settlements to mark progress. Every ridge could hide enemies, every valley could become a trap, and every mile they traveled took them further from any hope of rescue if their desperate mission failed. Iron Hawk set a punishing pace across the trackless wilderness, guided by landmarks invisible to Cassandra's untrained eyes but as clear as street signs to someone who had spent his entire life reading the language of stone and sky. They rode in single file, Gray Wolf and Spotted Elk flanking their small column, while the other warriors spread out in a protective formation that could respond quickly to threats from any direction. The military precision of their movement spoke to decades of experience. traveling through hostile territory where a single mistake could mean death for everyone. Cassandra had been given Iron Hawk's second horse, a sturdy paint mare named Wind, runner who seemed to understand the urgency of their mission. Despite her exhaustion and the trauma of witnessing her family's murder, she found herself adapting to the rhythm of long-distance riding with surprising speed. The physical demands of staying mounted and alert helped keep her mind focused on their immediate survival rather than the horrific memories that threatened to overwhelm her whenever she allowed herself to think about the massacre. The landscape they traversed told its own story of the escalating conflict between white settlers and native tribes. Burned homesteads dotted the horizon like broken teeth, their blackened timbers and scattered belongings marking places where families had tried to build new lives only to be consumed by the violence that plagued the territory. Some of these ruins were genuinely the result of tribal raids, Iron Hawk explained grimly, but an increasing number showed the telltale signs of false flag operations, designed to inflame racial hatred and justify military retaliation. How can you tell the difference? Cassandra asked during a brief rest stop beside a natural spring that bubbled up from limestone rocks carved smooth by centuries of wind and water. Iron Hawk pointed to a burned cabin visible in the distance. Real war parties take what they need: horses, weapons, food, blankets. They don't waste time destroying furniture or personal items unless they have specific reasons. But look at that homestead. The barn is burned, but the corral gate is still latched. No warrior would leave horses trapped to die in a fire. This was done by men who wanted to create horror, not by fighters seeking practical advantage. The distinction was subtle but significant. Another piece of evidence that Chivington's false flag operations were leaving signatures that trained eyes could read. Unfortunately, most white authorities either lacked the knowledge to recognize these signs or chose to ignore them in favor of narratives that supported their political goals. As they rode deeper into disputed territory, Iron Hawk began sharing intelligence that painted a disturbing picture of the conspiracy's scope. His network of allies among various tribes had been reporting similar patterns across the entire region: attacks that didn't match traditional warfare patterns, missing weapons and supplies from ambushed war parties, and increasing pressure from military forces that seemed unusually well informed about tribal movements and locations. 2 weeks ago, Running Elk's band was attacked near the Smoky Hill River, Iron Hawk explained as they navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of broken ground that could easily turn an ankle or break a horse's leg. 23 warriors killed, all their weapons taken, but the cavalry patrol that found them claimed they'd been surprised while raiding white settlements. The problem is, Running Elk's band had been camped in that location for 6 days, hunting buffalo for winter supplies. They hadn't been anywhere near white settlements. Cassandra felt sick understanding wash over her. So Chivington's people killed them specifically to get their weapons, then spread stories about them being raiders to justify the attack. Exactly. And when those weapons show up at future massacre sites, they'll provide authentic evidence of Cheyenne involvement. It's a self-reinforcing system of deception. The scale of the conspiracy was becoming clearer with each revelation. Chivington wasn't just staging occasional false flag attacks, he was systematically hunting peaceful tribal groups to harvest the materials needed to make his fabricated massacres more convincing. Every authentic arrow, every genuine war club, every traditional piece of equipment represented the death of someone who had never threatened white settlers. Gray Wolf, who had been scouting ahead, returned with troubling news that forced them to alter their route significantly. Cavalry patrol. 20 men, camped at Willow Creek Crossing, he reported. They're checking all travelers heading east, looking for someone matching the description of a white woman traveling with hostiles. Iron Hawk's expression darkened. Word travels fast. Chivington's people must have discovered that the Whitmore massacre had a survivor. How is that possible? Cassandra asked. We were careful to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Because someone talked, Spotted Elk said grimly. Someone at Fort Lyon knows exactly who was supposed to die in that wagon train. And when they count the bodies, they'll realize one is missing. The implications were chilling. If Chivington's agents knew that Cassandra had survived, they would be actively hunting her with resources far beyond what Iron Hawk's small war party could evade indefinitely. Every settlement they approached, every trail they used, every water source they needed would potentially be watched by men with orders to kill her on sight. We need to change our approach, Iron Hawk decided after considering their options. Direct travel to Fort Leavenworth is no longer possible. We'll have to take a longer route, through territory where cavalry patrols are less likely to venture. How much longer? Cassandra asked, though she suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. At least 2 weeks, possibly 3 if we encounter serious opposition. The delay was potentially catastrophic. The Hartwell freight convoy was scheduled to be attacked in less than 2 days, and the massacre at Sand Creek was planned for November 29th. Every day they spent evading pursuit was another day. Chivington had to implement his genocidal plan. There has to be another way, Cassandra said desperately. Someone closer who could help us, someone with enough authority to at least delay Chivington's operations. Iron Hawk considered the possibility. His knowledge of white power structures in the territory more extensive than most settlers realized. There's Judge Harrison in Colorado Springs. He's presiding over territorial disputes involving tribal land rights. If we could present our evidence to him. Harrison is Chivington's brother-in-law, Grey Wolf interrupted. He's been ruling against tribal claims consistently, always in favor of mining interests and railroad companies. Another door slammed shut. The conspiracies reach into civilian authority was deeper than they had realized, making it virtually impossible to find neutral arbiters who weren't already compromised by financial or political connections to the people they were trying to expose. What about the newspapers? Cassandra suggested. My husband always said that public pressure could force authorities to act when private appeals failed. Iron Hawk shook his head. The territorial papers are all controlled by mining companies and railroad investors. They profit from conflicts with the tribes because wars drive down land prices and create opportunities for government contracts. They're not going to publish anything that challenges the narrative of savage Indians threatening innocent settlers. Cassandra felt despair beginning to creep into her determination. Every potential ally was compromised, every official channel was blocked, and every day of delay brought Chivington closer to implementing his final solution. The evidence they carried was damning, but evidence was useless without someone willing and able to act on it. That evening, as they made camp in a hidden canyon where a small stream provided water and natural walls offered protection from observation, Iron Hawk made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. We're going to steal a telegraph, he announced, his tone suggesting that he had considered and rejected numerous alternatives before settling on this plan. Steal a telegraph? Cassandra repeated, unsure whether he was serious. The military telegraph line runs from Fort Lyon to Fort Leavenworth, carrying daily reports between regional commanders. If we can intercept those communications, we might be able to send our own messages directly to General Curtis without going through Chivington's chain of command. Grey Wolf looked skeptical. Telegraph equipment requires technical knowledge we don't possess, and the lines are guarded. Not all of them, Iron Hawk replied. The remote relay stations between major installations are often manned by only 1 or 2 operators. If we could capture a station long enough to send a message. It's insane, Spotted Elk said flatly. Even if we succeed in sending a message, how do we know Curtis will believe it? How do we know he'll act on it? Iron Hawk met Cassandra's eyes across the small fire they had risked building in the shelter of the canyon walls. Because we're going to send him something he can't ignore. We're going to transmit the exact text of Chivington's orders for the Sand Creek Massacre, including specific details that only someone with access to classified information could know. The plan was audacious to the point of seeming suicidal. But Cassandra found herself nodding slowly as she understood its logic. A telegraph message claiming that Chivington was planning a massacre could be dismissed as enemy propaganda. But a message that included precise tactical details, unit assignments, and scheduling information would prove that the sender had access to genuine military intelligence. Which relay station? She asked, accepting the plan despite its obvious dangers. Cedar Point, about 30 miles northeast of here. It's isolated enough that we can approach without being detected, but close enough to Fort Leavenworth that our message will reach Curtis quickly. Gray Wolf studied the terrain on the rough map that Iron Hawk sketched in the dirt beside there. Fire. The station will have at least 2 operators, probably armed guards as well. And once we attack it, every cavalry unit in the territory will be hunting us. Then we'd better make sure our message gets through on the first attempt. Iron Hawk said grimly. As they planned their desperate assault on the telegraph station, Cassandra found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken in just 4 days. A week earlier, she had been a simple homesteader's wife, worried about nothing more complex than preserving enough food for the coming winter and helping her husband with his newspaper articles. Now she was planning to participate in what amounted to an active war against the United States Army, motivated by evidence of a conspiracy so vast that it threatened to exterminate an entire people. The transformation wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Every mile they traveled together, every shared danger they faced, every moment of trust exchanged between herself and Iron Hawk's warriors was breaking down the racial barriers that had been carefully constructed by people like Chivington. She was beginning to understand that the savage Indians of newspaper accounts and political speeches were actually complex people with their own codes of honor, their own family loyalties, and their own desperate desire to protect everything they held dear. "Tell me about Sand Creek," she said quietly as the others prepared their weapons for the coming assault. "Tell me about the people Chivington wants to massacre." Iron Hawk's expression grew distant, touched by a mixture of love and terrible fear. 300 peaceful Cheyenne, mostly women, children, and elderly men. They chose to camp there because they believed the American flag would protect them. Black Kettle, their chief, was told by territorial officials that flying the American flag would guarantee their safety from military attack. "Your family?" "My wife, Summer Rain, my 2 daughters, Laughing Water and Morning Dove, my elderly father, who fought alongside white soldiers against the Kiowa 20 years ago and still wears the medal they gave him." Iron Hawk's voice grew thick with emotion. "My nephew, Little Bear, who is only 5 years old and loves to chase butterflies. My sister-in-law, White Cloud, who is pregnant with her first child." The personal stakes were devastating. This wasn't just about preventing a military atrocity, it was about saving Iron Hawk's entire world. Everyone he had ever loved. Cassandra felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "We'll stop them," she said, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "Whatever it takes, we'll stop them." Iron Hawk nodded, but his eyes remained haunted by possibilities too terrible to speak aloud. He had seen what Chivington's false flag operations looked like, had witnessed the calculated brutality that masqueraded as military necessity. If they failed to expose the conspiracy in time, Sand Creek would become another pile of mutilated corpses, another collection of fabricated evidence, another step toward the complete extermination of his people. The next morning brought unwelcome complications in the form of a rainstorm that turned the high plains into a treacherous maze of muddy terrain and reduced visibility. Traveling became significantly more difficult, but the weather also provided cover that allowed them to approach Cedar Point Relay Station without being detected by the mounted patrols that had been searching for them. The telegraph station was smaller than Cassandra had expected. a single wooden building surrounded by a corral for horses and a small garden where the operators grew vegetables to supplement their military rations. The telegraph lines themselves were supported by tall wooden poles that marched across the landscape like a procession of artificial trees, carrying their burden of copper wire toward distant destinations. 2 operators, 1 guard, Grey Wolf, reported after conducting careful reconnaissance. "The guard is drunk. I could smell the whiskey from 50 yards away. The operators are playing cards instead of monitoring their equipment." Iron Hawk nodded grimly. Military discipline at remote outposts was notoriously lax, especially when officers weren't present to enforce regulations. The isolation and boredom of telegraph duty led many operators to seek distraction in alcohol and gambling, creating opportunities for exactly the kind of attack they were planning. "Remember," Iron Hawk said as they prepared to assault the station, "we need at least 1 operator alive and capable of sending our message. Kill only if absolutely necessary." The attack itself was swift and efficient, a demonstration of tactical precision that left Cassandra both impressed and slightly horrified. Grey Wolf and Spotted Elk eliminated the guard with silent efficiency, while Iron Hawk and 2 other warriors burst through the station's front door, overwhelming the operators before they could reach their weapons or send any warning messages. Minutes. They controlled the telegraph equipment and had a terrified operator named Private Jensen sitting at the transmission key, his hands shaking as he prepared to send the message that could change the course of history. "Send exactly what I tell you," Iron Hawk commanded, placing the barrel of a captured rifle against Jensen's temple. "Any deviation, any attempt to signal for help, and you die immediately." Jensen nodded frantically, clearly understanding that these weren't empty threats. As Iron Hawk began dictating the message, Cassandra watched the operator's face grow increasingly pale as he realized the implications of what he was transmitting. The message was brief, but devastating. "General Curtis. Fort Leavenworth, urgent Colonel Cheyenne, planning massacre Sand Creek, November 29. 300 peaceful Cheyenne, including women, children, order signed territorial governor evidence, proves multiple false flag operations, design justify. Extermination witness available Cassandra Whitmore, survivor Devil Canyon Massacre SDO Payaz." Jensen tapped out the message. His face grew increasingly ashen. The specific details, the official language, the reference to classified operations, everything indicated that this wasn't the work of hostile Indians or disgruntled civilians. Someone with access to genuine military intelligence was exposing a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. "Message sent," Jensen whispered when the transmission was complete. "Confirmation?" Iron Hawk demanded. Jensen waited for the response, then nodded. "Fort Leavenworth acknowledges receipt. They're requesting additional details and verification of source." Iron Hawk looked at Cassandra, understanding that the critical moment had arrived. Everything they had risked, everyone they were trying to save, now depended on whether General Curtis would take their message seriously enough to investigate before it was too late. "Send this," Iron Hawk continued, beginning to dictate the most dangerous message of all, the one that would either save 2 peoples or doom them all to a war that would end in genocide. The second message, Iron Hawk dictated, would expose the conspiracy's darkest secret, but before Private Jensen could complete the transmission, a rifle shot exploded through the telegraph station's window, sending wood splinters flying like deadly rain. Jensen screamed and dove beneath his equipment table as Iron Hawk spun toward the sound, his weapon already raised. "Cavalry!" Grey Wolf shouted from outside, his voice carrying the unmistakable note of desperate urgency that meant they were outnumbered and surrounded. At least 30 riders coming from 3 directions. Cassandra felt her heart sink into her boots as the terrible realization hit her. The telegraph station hadn't been as isolated as they'd thought, or more likely, their approach had been observed and reported by hidden sentries they'd failed to detect. Either way, they were trapped in a wooden building surrounded by professional soldiers who had every advantage except knowledge of what was really at stake. How long before they reach us? Iron Hawk called back, still covering the terrified telegraph. Operator, 2 minutes, maybe less. Iron Hawk's mind raced through their limited options. The telegraph station offered minimal protection against a determined assault, and once the cavalry surrounded the building completely, escape would become impossible. But abandoning their mission now would condemn hundreds of innocent people to death at Sand Creek, not to mention allowing Chivington's broader conspiracy to continue unchallenged. Finish the transmission, he ordered Jensen, pressing the rifle barrel against the man's trembling neck. Send exactly what I tell you, and send it fast. Jensen's hands shook so violently that he could barely operate the telegraph key, but terror provided its own form of motivation. As the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, he tapped out the message that would either save or damn them all. Chivington orders, signed by Territorial Governor Evans Mining Consortium contracts, prove financial motive, eliminate tribes for mineral rights, witness possesses physical evidence, including forged weapons. Captured Sand Creek location confirmed SDOP. The response from Fort Leavenworth came back almost immediately, crackling through the telegraph equipment with an urgency that suggested General Curtis was personally monitoring the communications. Sender identity verification required cease transmission until authenticated SDOP. Iron Hawk cursed in Cheyenne. Curtis was too experienced a military commander to act on anonymous intelligence without verification, no matter how detailed or compelling it might seem. The general would demand proof that the message was genuine before risking his career on accusations that could destroy the territorial government. Tell him Cassandra Whitmore sends this, Iron Hawk ordered. Tell him she was raised by Morning Star of the Northern Cheyenne, that she speaks the sacred language, and that General Hancock will remember her testimony from the Fort Laramie Council 3 years ago. Jensen transmitted the identification, frantically, his fingers flying over the telegraph key as the sound of cavalry horses grew thunderous outside. The building shook as riders took positions around the station, voices shouting orders in the professional cadence of experienced soldiers preparing for assault. The response from Fort Leavenworth was immediate and electrifying. Cassandra Whitmore. Confirmed deceased Devil Canyon Massacre October 12th. Official reports state nitrogen monoxide. Survivors Stope. Iron Hawk felt ice form in his veins as the implications became clear. The official reports had already been filed, the cover story already established. According to the United States Army, Cassandra Whitmore was dead, killed along with every other member of the Wagon train in a savage Indian attack. Her survival was not just inconvenient to Chivington's conspiracy, it was an impossibility that threatened to unravel the entire fabricated narrative. They're going to kill me anyway, Cassandra said quietly, having read the message over Jensen's shoulder. Whether we escape this trap or not, they can't let me live to contradict their official story. Before Iron Hawk could respond, a voice rang out from outside the station, amplified by a speaking trumpet and carrying the unmistakable authority of military command. This is Colonel Chivington of the Colorado Volunteer Infantry. You are surrounded and outgunned. Surrender immediately, and the white woman will be spared. The offer was obviously false. They had just learned that Cassandra's death was already a matter of official record, but it revealed something important about Chivington's priorities. He wanted to capture rather than kill them, which suggested that torture and interrogation were part of his plan. The colonel needed to know how much they had discovered, who else they might have told, and whether any other copies of the incriminating evidence existed. What's your answer? Chivington's voice boomed again. You have 60 seconds to decide. Iron Hawk looked around the telegraph station, assessing their desperate situation with the calculating eye of a warrior who had survived impossible odds before. The building's wooden walls would provide minimal protection against rifle fire. But the telegraph equipment itself was made of heavy metal that could serve as improvised shields. More importantly, as long as they controlled the telegraph, they retained the ability to communicate with the outside world. "Send this," he told Jensen urgently. "Tell General Curtis that Colonel Chivington is personally leading the attack on this station, that he's trying to prevent transmission of evidence that would expose his conspiracy. Tell him that proves the intelligence is genuine." Jensen's hands flew over the telegraph key, transmitting the message even as rifle bullets began shattering the station's windows. The cavalry was obviously growing impatient with negotiations, or perhaps Chivington had decided that capturing prisoners alive was less important than silencing them permanently. The response from Fort Leavenworth was swift and decisive. Chivington presence confirmed suspicious maintained communication. Curtis dispatching immediate investigation. SDOP Hope flared in Cassandra's chest for the first time since the massacre at Devil's Canyon. General Curtis was taking their intelligence seriously, was willing to investigate despite the risks to his own career. But investigation took time, and time was a luxury they didn't possess with 30 cavalry soldiers preparing to storm their position. 30 seconds. Chivington's voice roared from outside. "Surrender now, or face the consequences." Iron Hawk made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of preparing for a desperate last stand, he handed his rifle to Gray Wolf and walked toward the station's front door with his hands raised in apparent surrender. "What are you doing?" Cassandra hissed, grabbing his arm to stop him. "Buying time," Iron Hawk replied calmly. "Chivington needs me alive to answer his questions. As long as he thinks he can extract information through interrogation, he won't risk killing his only source of intelligence about potential leaks in his conspiracy." It was a desperate gamble based on Iron Hawk's assessment of Chivington's psychology. But desperate situations demanded desperate measures. As he opened the door and stepped outside with his hands raised, Cassandra felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Colonel John Chivington was exactly what she had expected from his reputation, a large, imposing man with the kind of commanding presence that made other people instinctively step back and defer to his authority. His uniform was immaculate despite the long ride to reach the telegraph station, his boots polished to mirror brightness, his insignia gleaming with the pride of someone who took military appearance seriously. But his eyes were what truly marked him as dangerous, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. "Iron Hawk of the Northern Cheyenne," Chivington said, his voice carrying satisfaction mixed with professional interest. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your reputation for causing trouble precedes you." "Colonel Chivington," Iron Hawk replied evenly, showing no fear despite being surrounded by hostile soldiers. "I wondered when we would finally meet face to face. Where is the white woman? Where is Cassandra Whitmore?" "What white woman?" Iron Hawk asked innocently. "According to your official reports, all members of the Whitmore wagon train died in the Indian attack at Devil's Canyon. Surely you're not suggesting that your own documentation is inaccurate?" Chivington's face darkened with anger at having his lies thrown back at him so publicly. Several of his soldiers were close enough to hear the exchange, and Iron Hawk was clearly hoping to plant seeds of doubt about their commander's honesty. Military units functioned on trust and respect. If soldiers began questioning whether their officers were lying to them about basic facts, discipline could break down rapidly. "Don't play games with me, Chief," Chivington snarled. "We know she survived the attack. We know she's been traveling with your war party. And we know she's inside that telegraph station right now, probably sending treasonous messages to enemies of the territory." "If you know so much," Iron Hawk replied calmly, "then why do you need me to tell you anything?" The question hit its mark. Chivington's need for information revealed the weakness in his position. Despite his elaborate conspiracy, despite his network of corrupt officials and false flag operations, he was operating partially blind. He knew that dangerous intelligence was leaking, but he didn't know how much had been compromised or who else might be involved. "Because I want to know who else you've told," Chivington said, abandoning any pretense of civilized negotiation. "I want to know which of my operations have been compromised, which of my agents have been identified, and which officials in Denver might need to be reassigned." The threat was clear. Chivington wasn't just planning to eliminate immediate witnesses like Cassandra and Iron Hawk. He was prepared to murder anyone who might pose a threat to his conspiracy, including fellow government officials who had become inconvenient. The scope of his ambitions was becoming terrifyingly clear. "What makes you think I would tell you anything?" Iron Hawk asked. Chivington smiled, and the expression was more frightening than any threat he could have spoken aloud. "Because if you don't cooperate, I'm going to march my men to Sand Creek tomorrow instead of waiting until November 29th. Your wife Summer Rain, your daughters Laughing Water and Morning Dove, your elderly father with his precious military medal, they'll all die screaming while you watch helplessly." The personal threat hit Iron Hawk like a physical blow. Chivington knew about his family, knew their names, knew exactly where they were camped. The colonel had obviously been planning the Sand Creek massacre for months, gathering intelligence about every person who would be killed, every family that would be destroyed. "You're planning to murder them anyway," Iron Hawk said, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "True," Chivington admitted without a trace of shame. "But the manner of their deaths is still negotiable. Cooperate with me, and they'll die quickly. Force me to extract information through torture, and they'll suffer for days before I allow them to die." Inside the telegraph station, Cassandra listened to this exchange with growing horror and determination. Chivington wasn't just a corrupt military officer. He was a sadistic monster who took pleasure in describing the torture and murder of innocent families. The man who had ordered her husband's execution, who had killed 17 innocent people to maintain his cover story, was now threatening to massacre 300 peaceful Cheyenne with the same casual indifference he might show when ordering coffee. But she also heard something else in the conversation, an opportunity that might not come again. While Chivington was focused on interrogating Iron Hawk, his attention was divided and his soldiers were positioned to prevent escape rather than to monitor communications. If she could send one more message, if she could transmit the most damaging evidence while the colonel was distracted. "Jensen," she whispered urgently to the terrified telegraph operator. "Send this message to Fort Leavenworth immediately." "I can't," Jensen whimpered. "If Colonel Chivington finds out, he'll have me shot for treason. If you don't send it, he'll have you shot anyway." Cassandra replied with ruthless logic. "You've heard too much, seen too much. Men like Chivington don't leave witnesses alive, regardless of whether they cooperate." Jensen's face went pale as he realized the truth of her words. He was already a dead man as far as Chivington was concerned. His only choice was whether to die as a coward or as someone who had helped expose one of the most evil conspiracies in American history. "What's the message?" he asked, his hands returning to the telegraph key with renewed determination. Cassandra began dictating the most important transmission of her life, the message that would either save hundreds of innocent lives or seal her own doom. "Curtis, urgent Chivington admits Sand Creek massacre plan threatens. Torture murder families, confirms Governor Evans' involvement mining consortium financing operation. Witness recording all confessions STOP." As Jensen transmitted the message, Cassandra prayed that General Curtis would understand the implications and act quickly enough to prevent the approaching catastrophe. Outside, she could hear Chivington's voice growing more impatient as Iron Hawk continued to deflect his questions with the stoic dignity of a warrior who refused to be broken by threats. The response from Fort Leavenworth was immediate and electrifying. "Message: Received Curtis, departing immediately with full regiment maintained position until arrival. Federal investigation authorized STOP for the first time since the massacre at Devil's Canyon. Cassandra felt genuine hope flooding through her veins. General Curtis was coming with an entire regiment, enough military force to arrest Chivington and his corrupt subordinates, enough authority to override territorial officials who might try to interfere with a federal investigation. But hope also brought new dangers. If Chivington discovered that federal investigators were approaching, he might decide to eliminate all witnesses immediately rather than risk capture and trial. The next few hours would determine whether justice finally triumphed over corruption, or whether the conspiracy succeeded in silencing its accusers forever. Outside, the interrogation was reaching a critical point as Chivington's patience finally snapped completely. "Enough games," the colonel snarled. "Sergeant Morrison, prepare the irons. We're going to get our answers the hard way." As the sound of approaching soldiers filled the air, Cassandra realized that their desperate gamble had only bought them a few more hours of life. General Curtis and his regiment were coming, but would they arrive in time to prevent Chivington from torturing the truth out of his prisoners and then eliminating everyone who could testify against him? The answer would determine the fate of two peoples and the future of justice in the Colorado Territory. But for now, all Cassandra could do was prepare for whatever horrors were about to unfold, and pray that the evidence they had transmitted would be enough to ensure that their deaths would not be in vain. The iron shackles that Sergeant Morrison clamped around Iron Hawk's wrists were designed for interrogating prisoners of war. Heavy steel manacles connected by a short chain that prevented any meaningful resistance, while maximizing the subject's discomfort. Chivington had ordered them heated over a small fire until they glowed dull red, ensuring that every movement would bring fresh agony as the metal seared through skin and muscle. But what Chivington didn't realize was that Iron Hawk had endured similar torture before, during his capture by rival Kiowa warriors 15 years earlier. The Cheyenne war chief had learned that physical pain, however excruciating, was temporary and survivable. The key was to retreat into a mental space where suffering became abstract, disconnected from the essential self that could never be broken by mere flesh wounds. "Where is the woman?" Chivington demanded, standing close enough that Iron Hawk could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the anticipation gleaming his pale blue eyes. "Where is Cassandra Whitmore?" Iron Hawk remained silent, his face composed despite the agony radiating up his arms from the heated shackles. Inside the telegraph station, he knew that Cassandra was listening to every word, probably terrified, but hopefully still focused on their mission. Every minute he could delay Chivington's interrogation was another minute for General Curtis to arrive with federal troops. "Stubborn," Chivington observed with what might have been professional admiration. "I respect that in an enemy. But stubbornness without purpose is just stupidity, and I don't think you're stupid, Iron Hawk." The colonel began pacing around his prisoner with the measured steps of a predator circling wounded prey. His soldiers maintained a respectful distance, clearly uncomfortable with the brutality they were witnessing, but too disciplined to voice their objections. Several of the younger troopers kept glancing toward the telegraph station, obviously wondering why their commander was so obsessed with capturing one white woman. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," Chivington continued, his voice taking on the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather rather than torture and murder. "You're going to tell me everything you know about my operations. You're going to identify every person who has been helping you gather intelligence. And you're going to explain exactly how you learned about my plans for Sand Creek." Iron Hawk's expression didn't change, but inwardly he felt a spark of grim satisfaction. Chivington's questions revealed the scope of his paranoia and the weakness in his conspiracy. The colonel was operating under the assumption that Iron Hawk's knowledge came from systematic espionage rather than lucky discovery, which meant he was worried about security breaches throughout his entire organization. Still nothing to say? Chivington asked, stopping directly in front of his prisoner. Well, let me give you some motivation. The colonel withdrew a piece of paper from his uniform coat and unfolded it with theatrical precision. Even from a distance, Iron Hawk could see that it was a detailed map of the Sand Creek area, marked with tactical positions and unit assignments. But it was the additional notations that made his blood run cold. Precise locations of family lodges, marked with the names of the people who would be sleeping inside them when the attack came. Summer Rain, Lodge Number 7, Chivington read aloud. Laughing Water and Morning Dove, Lodge Number 12 with their grandmother. Your father, old. White Buffalo, Lodge Number 3 with his collection of military medals that he's so proud of. The colonel's knowledge was horrifyingly specific, demonstrating that he had been planning the Sand Creek massacre for months with the thoroughness of a military operation. He knew not just where Iron Hawk's family would be during the attack, but exactly how they were arranged within the camp, which lodges they occupied, even personal details about their daily routines. How long have you been planning this? Iron Hawk asked, breaking his silence for the first time since his capture. Chivington smiled with genuine pleasure. Ah, he speaks. To answer your question, 18 months of careful preparation. You see, Iron Hawk, I don't do anything halfway. When I decided that the Indian problem in Colorado required a final solution, I made sure to gather all the intelligence necessary to implement that solution effectively. The admission was devastating, confirming that the Sand Creek massacre wasn't a spontaneous military decision, but a premeditated act of genocide, planned with bureaucratic precision. Chivington had spent over a year studying his targets, identifying specific families, mapping their locations, and timing his attack for maximum psychological impact. But you're getting ahead of yourself, the colonel continued. We haven't reached the point where I answer your questions. We're still at the point where you answer mine. Inside the telegraph station, Cassandra listened to this exchange with growing horror and desperate determination. Every word Chivington spoke was additional evidence of his guilt, but only if someone survived to testify about what they had heard. She needed to document everything, to create a record that would survive even if they didn't. Jensen, she whispered urgently to the telegraph operator. Can you send messages without the receiving station acknowledging them? Can you transmit information even if no one responds? Jensen nodded nervously. The equipment can broadcast messages whether anyone receives them or not. But why would you want to? Because I want to create a permanent record, Cassandra interrupted. I want every word Chivington says to be transmitted to Fort Leavenworth, even if General Curtis isn't there to receive them immediately. When federal investigators examine the telegraph logs, they'll have a complete transcript of his confession. It was a brilliant strategy born of desperation. Even if Chivington succeeded in murdering all the witnesses, the telegraph records would preserve their testimony for future investigators. Every admission of guilt, every threat against innocent families, every detail of the conspiracy would be permanently documented in the Army's own communication system. Jensen's hands flew over the telegraph key as he began transmitting Chivington's words verbatim. Chivington states 18 months planning Sand Creek massacre, detailed intelligence on family locations, admits final solution for Indian problem, STOP outside. The interrogation was intensifying as Chivington grew impatient with Iron Hawk's continued silence. The colonel produced a second piece of paper, this one covered with names and financial figures that made the conspiracy's scope even clearer. The Denver Mining Consortium has invested $2 million in extraction equipment for the mineral rights around Sand Creek, Chivington explained with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a profitable business venture. Gold, silver, copper, enough wealth to fund territorial development for the next 50 years. But those mineral rights are worthless as long as treaty obligations prevent white settlers from accessing the land. Iron Hawk felt sick understanding. wash over him. The Sand Creek Massacre wasn't just about racial hatred or military glory, it was about money. Enormous amounts of money that mining companies were willing to pay for access to lands that legally belonged to the Cheyenne under federal treaties. So you see, Chivington continued, your people's death isn't personal. It's simply a business necessity. The territorial government needs revenue to fund development projects. The mining companies need access to profitable mineral deposits. And I need a military victory dramatic enough to secure my promotion to general rank. The casual way Chivington discussed genocide as an economic transaction was perhaps the most chilling aspect of his entire confession. He felt no hatred toward the Cheyenne, no passion for their destruction. They were simply obstacles to be removed with the same dispassionate efficiency he might apply to clearing trees from a construction site. But the beauty of my plan, the Colonel continued, warming to his subject, is that everyone benefits. The miners get their land, the territory gets its revenue, I get my promotion, and the American people get protection from savage Indian raids that threaten innocent settlers. Raids that you staged yourself, Iron Hawk said quietly. Details, Chivington waved dismissively. The important thing is results. Public opinion supports military action against hostile tribes. Congress continues funding territorial defense. Operations and my superiors see evidence of aggressive leadership in dealing with frontier threats. Inside the telegraph station, Cassandra continued documenting every word of Chivington's confession, creating an indictment that grew more damning with each transmitted sentence. Chivington admits staging false flag attacks, confirms mining consortium financial backing, describes genocide as business necessity, SDOP, but even as she worked to preserve evidence of the conspiracy, Cassandra could see that time was running out. Chivington's interrogation was becoming more aggressive, and Iron Hawk's stoic resistance was clearly pushing the Colonel toward more extreme measures. Sergeant Morrison, Chivington called to his subordinate, bring me the woman. Perhaps Iron Hawk will be more cooperative when he watches what happens to white traitors who side with hostiles. Morrison hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the order. Sir, the woman is a civilian. Military regulations prohibit. Military regulations. Chivington interrupted with cold fury. Prohibit a great many things that become necessary during wartime. Are you questioning my authority, Sergeant? Morrison's face went pale as he realized the trap Chivington had set for him. Refusing to obey a direct order would result in court-martial and execution, but following orders that violated military law would make him complicit in war crimes. Either choice could destroy his career and possibly his life. No, sir, Morrison replied finally, his voice hollow with resignation. I'll retrieve the woman. As Morrison and two other soldiers approached the telegraph station, Cassandra felt panic rising in her throat like bile. She had known this moment would come, had tried to prepare herself mentally for whatever torture Chivington might inflict, but the reality of facing systematic brutality was more terrifying than any imagined. Scenario. Yensen, she said urgently, keep transmitting everything that happens. Whatever they do to me, whatever I say under torture, make sure it all gets recorded. Yensen nodded grimly, understanding that he was about to become the chronicler of atrocities that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His hands continued moving over the telegraph key with mechanical precision, driven by a determination to ensure that the truth survived even if the witnesses DIDN single quotes T'd at the door to the telegraph station burst open as Morrison and his soldiers entered with weapons drawn. They found Cassandra standing beside the telegraph equipment with her hands raised, her face pale but composed, despite the terror that must have been coursing through her veins. Cassandra Whitmore, Morrison said formally, though his voice carried reluctance and shame. By order of Colonel Chivington, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy with hostile Indians, and espionage against the United States Army. On what evidence? Cassandra asked, her voice steadier than she had expected. Morrison's expression grew more uncomfortable. Evidence will be obtained during interrogation. The euphemism was transparent. Chivington planned to torture a confession out of her, then use that forced admission to justify whatever punishment he chose to impose. It was a perversion of military justice that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with the Spanish Inquisition or other historical examples of state-sanctioned brutality. As the soldiers escorted Cassandra outside, she caught a glimpse of Iron Hawk still chained between two posts, his face showing the effects of prolonged torture, but his eyes still blazing with unbroken defiance. When their gazes met, he gave her an almost imperceptible nod, not of farewell, but of encouragement and shared determination. Chivington's face lit up with anticipation as Cassandra was brought before him. "The famous Mrs. Whitmore," he said, with mock courtesy. "The woman who supposedly died at Devil's Canyon, but somehow managed to rise from the dead to cause me considerable inconvenience." "I'm very much alive," Cassandra replied evenly, "as are the 17 people you murdered to cover up your conspiracy." "Murdered?" Chivington laughed, but the sound held no humor. "My dear woman, those people died in a tragic Indian attack. I have official reports documenting the entire incident, signed by 3 different officers and confirmed by territorial authorities. Reports that you fabricated," Cassandra said, "based on evidence that you planted and testimony that you coerced." Chivington's expression grew more serious. "You seem remarkably well informed about classified military operations. That suggests espionage activities that carry the death penalty under territorial law." The accusation was absurd. Cassandra's knowledge came from witnessing the massacre firsthand, not from spying on military installations, but she understood that logical consistency wasn't the point. Chivington needed a legal pretext for eliminating witnesses, and accusations of espionage provided the necessary justification. "I saw your men kill my family," Cassandra said simply. "I heard them discussing their orders, saw them plant evidence to blame the Cheyenne." "That's not espionage, that's eyewitness testimony to mass murder." "Eyewitness testimony from a woman who was officially reported dead?" Chivington's smile grew predatory. Who would believe such an obviously fabricated story? It was the central weakness in Cassandra's position, and Chivington clearly understood its implications. By declaring her dead in official reports, he had made her survival legally impossible. Any testimony she might give could be dismissed as the delusions of someone impersonating a deceased person, or as enemy propaganda designed to undermine legitimate military operations. But Cassandra had one advantage that Chivington hadn't anticipated. Telegraph equipment was still transmitting everything he said to Fort Leavenworth, creating a permanent record that would be much harder to dismiss or fabricate. Every word of his confession was being documented by the Army's own communication system, establishing a chain of evidence that couldn't be easily broken. "General Curtis will be very interested in your explanations," Cassandra said, hoping to provoke more admissions that Jensen could transmit. Chivington's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Curtis is 3 days away and has no authority in Colorado Territory. By the time he arrives, this situation will have been resolved through proper military channels." "You mean by the time he arrives, all the witnesses will be dead?" "I mean," Chivington said coldly, "that by the time he arrives, a successful military operation against hostile Indians will have eliminated a significant threat to territorial security. Any surviving witnesses will confirm that Colonel Chivington acted with appropriate decisiveness in the face of enemy aggression." The threat was clear. Chivington planned to massacre Iron Hawk's people at Sand Creek immediately, then claimed that the telegraph station incident was part of a coordinated Indian uprising that justified his actions. Any witnesses who might contradict his story would be eliminated before federal investigators could interview them. But as Chivington prepared to begin the torture that would extract whatever information he needed to complete his conspiracy, The sound of distant hoofbeats reached everyone's ears. At first, it might have been dismissed as an echo of the wind across the plains, but the rhythmic cadence grew steadily stronger until it was unmistakably the sound of many horses approaching at high speed. "Patrol coming in," one of Chivington's soldiers reported, lowering his spyglass. "Single rider, moving fast, looks like he's carrying dispatches." Chivington frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption to his interrogation. "What dispatches? I'm not expecting any communications." The rider who galloped into the telegraph station clearing was obviously exhausted, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. He dismounted unsteadily and approached Chivington with the urgent manner of someone carrying critical intelligence. "Colonel." "Chivington, sir," the messenger gasped. "Emergency dispatch from Fort Lyon. General Curtis has left Fort Leavenworth with a full regiment, sir. He's demanding immediate explanations for unauthorized telegraph communications and threatening federal investigation of territorial military operations." Chivington's face went white as he realized that his worst fears were coming true. Curtis wasn't just responding to anonymous intelligence. He was conducting a formal federal investigation with enough military force to override any territorial authority that might try to interfere. "How long until Curtis arrives?" Chivington demanded. 6 hours, sir. Maybe less if he pushes his horses hard. 6 hours. Enough time to eliminate witnesses and establish a cover story, but not enough time to implement the careful deception that Chivington had planned. The colonel's conspiracy was unraveling faster than he could adapt, forcing him into increasingly desperate measures that would ultimately reveal his guilt to anyone with eyes to see. As Chivington struggled to salvage his plans, Cassandra felt hope and terror warring in her chest. General Curtis was coming with federal authority and enough military force to challenge Chivington directly. But 6 hours was also enough time for a desperate man to commit atrocities that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The final confrontation was approaching, and everything they had fought for would be decided in the next few hours. Chivington's face twisted into an expression of pure rage as the full implications of General Curtis's approach became clear. 6 hours wasn't enough time to cover up 18 months of carefully orchestrated conspiracy, but it was more than enough time to eliminate every witness who could testify against him. The colonel's calculated facade finally cracked, revealing the desperate killer beneath the military uniform. "Change of plans," he snarled to his assembled soldiers. "We're moving to Sand Creek immediately. Full attack formation, no prisoners, no survivors." Several of his officers exchanged uneasy glances. Attacking a peaceful Indian village without provocation violated multiple military regulations and international laws of warfare. But questioning Chivington's orders had already proven dangerous for subordinates who valued their careers and lives. "Sir," Lieutenant Hayes ventured cautiously, "our orders were to maintain current positions until—" "Our orders," Chivington interrupted with deadly quiet, "are whatever I say they are. Unless you're suggesting that you know better than your commanding officer how to handle hostile Indian insurgents." The threat was unmistakable. Hayes fell silent, but the doubt in his eyes was shared by many of the soldiers who had witnessed Chivington's interrogation techniques. These men had enlisted to protect American settlers from genuine threats, not to participate in the systematic murder of women and children for mining company profits. Cassandra watched this exchange with growing horror and desperate inspiration. Chivington's mask was slipping in front of his own troops, revealing his true nature to soldiers who still retained some sense of military honor. If she could push him further, force him to expose more of his conspiracy in front of witnesses who couldn't be easily silenced. "You're making a mistake," she said loudly enough for every soldier to hear. "General Curtis isn't coming alone. He's bringing federal marshals, war correspondents, and congressional investigators. Massacring Sand Creek now will only provide them with fresh evidence of your war crimes." Chivington backhanded her across the face with enough force to knock her to the ground, blood streaming from her split lip. But the violence only reinforced her point. This wasn't the behavior of a legitimate military commander, but of a desperate criminal trying to silence inconvenient witnesses. "Shut your mouth, whore," Chivington snarled. "You're already dead according to official records. Making you actually dead is just a clerical correction." The crude language and naked brutality shocked some of the younger soldiers who had been raised to believe that officers were gentlemen bound by codes of honor and professional conduct. Seeing their colonel strike a defenseless woman while threatening genocide shattered illusions that would be difficult to rebuild. "Sergeant Morrison," Chivington continued, his voice regaining some of its military precision, "detail 10 men to execute the prisoners. Make it look like they were killed while attempting to escape. The rest of us ride for Sand Creek within the hour." Morrison's face went ashen. He was being ordered to murder prisoners in cold blood, then lie about the circumstances to cover up war crimes. The military justice system that he had served faithfully for 15 years was collapsing around him, replaced by the arbitrary brutality of a commanding officer who had clearly lost all moral restraint. "Colonel," Morrison said carefully, "perhaps we should wait for General Curtis to arrive. If there are questions about our operations, it would be better to answer them through proper channels rather than what, Sergeant?" Chivington's voice carried deadly quiet. "Rather than protect American lives from savage Indian attacks, rather than implement the decisive military action that territorial security requires. Or are you suggesting that we allow political interference to prevent us from doing our duty?" The twisted logic was brilliant in its cynicism. Chivington was reframing his genocidal conspiracy as patriotic duty, making any opposition seem like treason or cowardice. Soldiers who objected to murdering innocent civilians could be accused of lacking the courage to protect American settlers from hostile Indians. Iron Hawk, still chained between the wooden posts but alert to every nuance of the conversation, recognized the critical moment that was approaching. Chivington's authority was based on his soldiers' willingness to follow orders without question, but that willingness was eroding as his true nature became impossible to ignore. If enough troops refused to participate in the massacre, the colonel's conspiracy would collapse regardless of what happened to individual witnesses. "Your soldiers know the truth," Iron Hawk said, his voice carrying across the entire camp despite his physical weakness. "They've heard you admit that the attacks were staged, that innocent families will die for mining company profits. How many of them enlisted to become paid murderers for corporate interests?" Chivington spun toward his prisoner with fury blazing in his eyes. "How many of them enlisted to listen to savage propaganda?" he shot back. "This Indian is trying to turn American soldiers against their own commanders with lies designed to weaken military discipline. But the damage was already done." Iron Hawk's words had crystallized doubts that were already forming in the minds of soldiers who had witnessed too much evidence of their colonel's corruption. The younger troops especially were beginning to understand that they were being asked to participate in atrocities that had nothing to do with legitimate military objectives. Private Collins, a 19-year-old farm boy from Kansas who had joined the army to earn money for his family's struggling homestead, stepped forward with obvious reluctance but unmistakable determination. "Colonel Chivington, sir," Collins said, his voice trembling but clear, "I didn't sign up to kill women and children. If Sand Creek is a peaceful village like they say, then attacking it would be murder, not military action." The challenge was unprecedented. A junior enlisted man directly questioning the morality of his superior's orders in front of the entire command. Military discipline demanded instant punishment for such insubordination, but Chivington's response would reveal his true priorities to every soldier present. "Private Collins," Chivington said with deceptive calm, "you're relieved of duty pending court-martial for insubordination and cowardice in the face of the enemy. Sergeant Morrison, place this man under arrest. But Morrison didn't move. The sergeant stood frozen between conflicting loyalties, obedience to military authority versus allegiance to moral principles that transcended rank and regulation. His choice would determine whether Chivington retained enough support to implement his genocidal plan. "Sergeant Morrison," Chivington repeated, his voice growing more dangerous. "Did you hear my order?" "Yes, sir," Morrison replied quietly. "But I'm not sure it's a lawful order." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. A non-commissioned officer was openly questioning the legitimacy of his commanding officer's instructions, suggesting that military law itself was being violated. Other soldiers began murmuring among themselves, emboldened by Morrison's example to voice their own doubts and concerns. Chivington realized that his authority was disintegrating before his eyes. The conspiracy that had required absolute secrecy and unquestioning obedience was being exposed to subordinates who retained enough moral conscience to recognize evil when it stood directly in front of them. "Any soldier who refuses to follow orders will be shot for mutiny," Chivington declared, drawing his sidearm and pointing it at Morrison's chest. "We are at war, and wartime regulations apply to anyone who gives aid and comfort to the enemy." But his threat only accelerated the collapse of military discipline. Soldiers began backing away from their colonel, hands moving instinctively toward their own weapons as they realized that the greatest threat to their safety might be coming from their own command structure rather than from any external enemy. Inside the telegraph station, Jensen continued transmitting every word of the confrontation to Fort Leavenworth, creating a permanent record of Chivington's breakdown and the mutiny it was provoking among his own troops. Chivington threatening execution of subordinates' mutiny. Developing among troops, soldiers refusing orders to massacre civilian situation, deteriorating rapidly. Steop. Response from Fort Leavenworth came back within minutes. Crackling through the telegraph equipment with desperate urgency. Curtis 4 hours. Out-maintain position. Federal marshals, authorized arrest authority. Do not engage hostile forces. Await federal intervention. SDOP 4 hours. Close enough to provide hope, but still far enough away that desperate men could commit irreversible atrocities before help arrived. Chivington was clearly calculating the same timeline, understanding that he had a narrow window to eliminate witnesses and establish facts on the ground that would be difficult for federal investigators to challenge. "Lieutenant Hayes," Chivington called to one of his few remaining loyal officers, "take 20 men and ride immediately for Sand Creek. Begin the attack whether I arrive or not. Make sure there are no survivors to contradict our report about hostile Indian activities." Hayes hesitated, clearly understanding that he was being ordered to implement genocide while his commanding officer dealt with the immediate crisis at the telegraph station. The lieutenant's military career would be destroyed whether he obeyed or refused, but his choice would also determine the fate of 300 innocent Cheyenne civilians. "Colonel," Hayes said slowly, "perhaps we should reconsider the timing. If General Curtis is investigating our operations, attacking Sand Creek now might provide ammunition for our critics rather than—" "Lieutenant Hayes," Chivington interrupted with cold finality, "you have your orders. Carry them out immediately, or join Sergeant Morrison under arrest for mutiny." The ultimatum was designed to force a choice between personal survival and moral conscience, but it also revealed the weakness in Chivington's position. He was increasingly dependent on subordinates who understood that they were being asked to sacrifice their honor and possibly their lives to protect their commander's criminal conspiracy. As Hayes struggled with his impossible decision, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the plains from the direction of Sand Creek. Chivington's face lit up with savage satisfaction as he realized what the shooting meant. "It appears Lieutenant Colonel Sowell has taken initiative," he said with grim pleasure. "The Sand Creek operation is already underway." Cassandra felt her heart sink into her boots as she understood the implications. While they had been fighting to preserve evidence and expose the conspiracy, other elements of Cheyvenne's command had been moving to implement the genocide that would eliminate Iron Hawk's family and justify everything that had happened at the telegraph station. The race against time had been lost, and 300 innocent people were about to pay the ultimate price for Cheyvenne's ambition and greed. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Cassandra realized that their struggle wasn't over yet. The evidence was preserved, federal investigators were approaching, and Cheyvenne's own troops were beginning to understand the evil they had been asked to serve. Justice might still be possible, even if it came too late to save the people who deserved it most. The thunder of approaching cavalry reached them before the dust cloud appeared on the horizon. But these weren't Cheyvenne's reinforcements. They were federal troops under General Curtis's direct command, riding in formation, with the disciplined precision of soldiers who had never forgotten that their primary duty was to serve justice rather than personal ambition. The sight of Curtis's blue and gold regimental colors created a moment of stunned silence among Cheyvenne's mutinous soldiers, as if none of them had quite believed that federal intervention would actually materialize. General Samuel Curtis was everything. Cheyvenne wasn't a career officer who had earned his rank through battlefield competence rather than political maneuvering. A man whose weathered face reflected decades of making decisions based on military necessity rather than personal profit. As he dismounted near the telegraph station, his keen gray eyes took in the scene with the swift assessment of someone accustomed to reading complex tactical situations. "Colonel Cheyenne," Curtis said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never needed to threaten subordinates to maintain discipline. "You will surrender your weapon immediately and submit to federal custody pending investigation of war crimes charges." Cheyvenne's hand tightened on his pistol, but he was surrounded by Curtis's troops and abandoned by his own soldiers, who had stepped back to create clear lines of fire should their disgraced commander choose resistance over surrender. The conspiracy that had once seemed so carefully constructed was crumbling like a house built on sand, leaving its architect isolated and defenseless. "On what authority?" Cheyenne demanded, though his voice lacked its former confidence. "This is territorial jurisdiction, and I am acting under direct orders from Governor Evans." Curtis smiled grimly as he produced a leather portfolio from his uniform coat. "On the authority of President Lincoln himself, who was quite interested to learn about territorial officials conducting unauthorized military operations for private financial gain." The documents Curtis displayed bore official seals that even Cheyenne couldn't dispute presidential authorization for a federal investigation into corruption within Colorado territorial government, complete with powers of arrest that superseded any local authority. The conspiracy had reached so high and become so brazen that it had attracted attention from the highest levels of the federal government. "Moreover," Curtis continued, "we intercepted communications from Lieutenant Colonel Sowell at Sand Creek reporting that he refused your orders to attack peaceful civilians. The massacre you've been planning has been prevented by officers who still remember their oath to protect innocent lives." Cassandra felt overwhelming relief wash through her as she understood what Curtis was saying. Iron Hawk's family was safe. The Sand Creek massacre had been stopped by military officers who had chosen conscience over career advancement. The gunfire they had heard was probably Sowell's troops arresting Cheyvenne's co-conspirators, rather than implementing genocide. "Impossible," Cheyenne snarled. "Sowell wouldn't dare disobey direct orders." "Actually," Curtis replied with evident satisfaction, "Sowell has been working as a federal informant for 6 months, documenting your illegal activities and reporting them to my headquarters. Your conspiracy was compromised long before Mrs. Whitmore's testimony provided the final evidence we needed." The revelation hit Cheyenne like a physical blow. Not only had his carefully constructed conspiracy failed, but it had been penetrated and monitored by federal agents from the beginning. Every meeting, every order, Every financial transaction had been documented by someone he had trusted completely. Iron Hawk, still chained, but now free from the immediate threat of execution, looked up at Curtis with something approaching respect. "General, my people at Sand Creek are safe and under federal protection," Curtis assured him. "Your wife, Summer Rain, specifically asked me to tell you that your daughters are well and eager for your return." The personal message, delivered with obvious knowledge of Iron Hawk's family situation, demonstrated that Curtis's intervention wasn't just bureaucratic, it was comprehensive and informed by detailed intelligence about everyone involved in the conspiracy. The federal investigation had been thorough enough to identify not just the criminals but also their intended victims. As Curtis's troops moved to arrest Cheyenne and his remaining supporters, Private Jensen emerged from the telegraph station with a thick sheaf of paper containing transcripts of every message he had transmitted during the crisis. The young operator's hands were still shaking from the strain of documenting hours of confessions and threats, but his expression showed pride in having preserved evidence that would ensure justice for the conspiracy's victims. "General Curtis," Jensen said, saluting awkwardly with his free hand. "Complete transcript of all communications during the incident, sir." Colonel Cheyenne's confessions are documented verbatim, including admissions of staging false flag attacks and planning genocide for mining company profits. Curtis accepted the transcript with obvious satisfaction. Military courts-martial required precise documentation of crimes, and Jensen's real-time record would provide unimpeachable evidence of Cheyenne's guilt. No amount of political influence or legal maneuvering could overcome testimony that had been transmitted through the Army's own communication system. "Mrs. Whitmore," Curtis said, turning to Cassandra with formal courtesy, "your courage in exposing this conspiracy has prevented atrocities that would have haunted our nation for generations. The federal government owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Cassandra looked around at the scene of their final confrontation. Cheyenne in shackles, his corrupt subordinates under arrest, Iron Hawk being freed by federal troops, and the evidence of genocide preserved for justice. 3 weeks earlier, she had been a simple homesteader's wife. Now she was a key witness in one of the most significant war crimes investigations in American history. "Will the trials be public?" she asked, understanding that exposure was the only guarantee against future conspiracies. "Completely public," Curtis confirmed. "President Lincoln has ordered full transparency in these proceedings. The American people need to understand how territorial officials perverted military authority for private gain, and they need to see that justice applies equally to everyone, regardless of rank or political connections." As Curtis's troops prepared to transport their prisoners to federal custody, Iron Hawk was finally released from the chains that had bound him throughout his ordeal. Despite his injuries and exhaustion, his first action was to approach Cassandra with the formal dignity of a warrior acknowledging a battle companion. "White Dove," he said, using her Cheyenne name from childhood, "Morning Star would be proud of your courage. You have honored her memory and saved many lives through your willingness to speak truth against power." "We saved them together," Cassandra replied, understanding that their unlikely alliance had been crucial to exposing the conspiracy. "Your knowledge, my testimony, Jensen's documentation, no one person could have stopped Cheyenne alone." The observation was profound in its implications. The conspiracy had been defeated not by individual heroism but by cooperation between people who should have been enemies according to the racial hatred that Cheyenne had tried to exploit. Cheyenne war chief, a white homesteader's widow, and a young telegraph operator had proven that justice was stronger than the artificial divisions that corrupt officials used to maintain their power. 6 months later, Cassandra stood in a Denver courtroom as federal prosecutors presented the evidence that would send Cheyenne and 13 co-conspirators to federal prison for life. The trial had attracted national attention, exposing the depths of corruption that had infected territorial government and leading to reforms that would prevent similar conspiracies in the future. Iron Hawk, wearing the formal regalia of a Cheyenne peace chief, provided testimony that demonstrated the systematic nature of the false flag operations. His family sat in the courtroom's gallery, living proof that genocide had been prevented by the courage of people who refused to remain silent in the face of evil. The Denver Mining Consortium was dissolved by federal order. Its assets used to provide reparations to the families of massacre victims and to establish schools for both white and Native American children throughout Colorado Territory. Governor Evans resigned in disgrace, replaced by a federal administrator who was tasked with rebuilding territorial government according to principles of honesty and equal justice. As Cassandra left the courthouse after the final verdict, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from a woman to traumatized to speak to someone whose testimony had changed the course of history. The voice that had been stolen by witnessing her family's murder had been restored through the act of speaking truth about injustice. 3 years later, Cassandra Whitmore and Iron Hawk would establish the first integrated school in Colorado Territory, where children of all races learned together in classrooms, funded by money that corrupt officials had intended to use for genocide. It was, they both agreed, the most fitting memorial possible for the 17 innocent people who had died at Devil's Canyon to preserve a terrible secret. Sometimes justice comes slowly, but when it finally arrives, it transforms everything. It touches including the people who were brave enough to demand it in the first place.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.